Introduction to Garda Vetting, Relevant Work and the NVB Act. In this video, you will learn about Garda Vetting, benefits of Garda Vetting, who requires Garda Vetting, relevant work, and the National Vetting Bureau Children and Vulnerable Persons Act. What is Garda Vetting? Garda Vetting is a process to check whether or not a person has a criminal record. It also checks if there is information on record that would indicate if that person would pose a threat to children or vulnerable adults. Garda Vetting is carried out by the National Vetting Bureau, which is the vetting department of An Garda Síochána. Benefits of Garda Vetting. Having up-to-date vetting records supports the safeguarding of children and vulnerable adults, supports good recruitment decisions and helps to determine the suitability of a person for a role with the HSE, ensures compliance with legal obligations under the National Vetting Bureau Children and Vulnerable Persons Act, which is the legislation governing Garda Vetting. Who requires Garda Vetting? The National Vetting Bureau Children and Vulnerable Persons Act, or NVB Act for short, sets out an organisation's obligations in respect of vetting and what roles must be vetted. If a person is undertaking work or activities relating to children or vulnerable adults, then it is likely Garda Vetting is required. This type of work is known as relevant work. The NVB Act makes Garda Vetting a mandatory and legal requirement for any person engaging in relevant work. HSE policy in the past used to require all new entrants to be vetted. However, following the introduction of the NVB Act, the HSE Garda Vetting policy was changed. Blanket vetting everyone is no longer permitted, as vetting can only be sought for persons who are engaging in relevant work. Obtaining Garda Vetting for a person who is not engaged in relevant work is an offence. Relevant work. The NVB Act defines in detail what constitutes relevant work and also includes definitions for child and vulnerable person. Relevant work is any work or activity which is carried out by a person, a necessary and regular part of which consists mainly of the person having access to or contact with children or vulnerable persons. In order for a role to be deemed relevant work, it must meet this criteria or one of the other definitions of relevant work detailed in Schedule 1 of the NVB Act. The full list is available in the GVLO's Guide for Managers. Identifying relevant work. For many roles, it is easy to establish that the role meets the criteria for relevant work. Let's look at a couple of examples. Doctors, nurses, healthcare assistants are engaging in relevant work as the duties of these roles always require them to work directly with children or vulnerable persons. In fact, they would be unable to complete their duties without coming in contact with children or vulnerable adults. For other roles, it may take a little more thought to determine if the role is relevant work. An assessment of the duties of the role, giving consideration to whether or not they meet any of the criteria within the NVB Act, will help to clarify whether the role is relevant work. Let's look at the role of medical scientist. A medical scientist working in a lab with other scientists is not engaged in relevant work. However, a medical scientist providing support on wards, assisting in biopsies, or maintaining equipment in patients' rooms are engaged in relevant work. A clerical officer processing patients' files, or a clerical officer working in the payroll department that does not require any patient contact is not engaged in relevant work. Although they are based in an acute hospital, none of their duties require them to have access to or contact with children or vulnerable adults. and so these roles are deemed not to be relevant work. A clerical officer working in a paediatric ward whose duties do require them to have regular direct contact with children, or a clerical officer working in an ED department whose duties require regular contact with patients. These roles are engaged in relevant work. Chef. A chef who works in the kitchen area of an acute hospital is not engaged in relevant work because they do not require access to children or vulnerable adults in order to perform the duties of their chef role. However, some chefs do engage in relevant work. For example, a chef who undertakes cooking activities with residents in an older person's residential service. This activity involves working with vulnerable persons, and therefore this is relevant work. The National Vetting Bureau Children and Vulnerable Persons Act is the legislation governing Garda vetting. The NVB Act has introduced a number of key changes to Garda vetting. New hires. Since the introduction of the NVB Act in April 2016, all new hires, including volunteers, those on work placement, and contractors, etc., had to be Garda vetted before commencing relevant work. It is an offence to engage anyone in relevant work without first having completed Garda vetting. Retrospective vetting. Anyone engaging in relevant work for the HSE who had not been previously vetted had to be vetted by the end of April 2018. After this date, it became an offence to continue working in relevant work without Garda vetting. Re-vetting. Under a part of the NVB Act, which is due to be enacted, re-vetting requires a person who was vetted to be vetted again, i.e. re-vetted at regular intervals so records are up to date. The HSE has already begun re-vetting on a 3-year cycle in anticipation of it becoming a mandatory legal requirement. If you have individuals in your area whose vetting record is over 3 years old, you are advised to begin the re-vetting process now. If you have any queries about the Garda vetting process or need assistance, the GVLO is here to help. You can contact us by emailing gardavetting@hse.ie.